On the night of September 3rd, 2022, police in the small town of Cedar Glen responded to a 911 call placed by a frantic male voice. The caller identified himself as Matthew Keller and stated, "I think I just killed my wife." When officers arrived at the scene, a modest two-bedroom house on Brookhaven Lane, they found the body of 32-year-old Laura Keller slumped over on the living room couch. She had been shot once in the head. The television was on. A smartphone was lying face down on the rug. Matthew Keller, age 34, was immediately taken into custody without resistance. He appeared dazed, muttering that he didn't mean to do it, and she was laughing right in front of me. Detectives began canvassing the house, logging every item and moment as part of the investigation. What they found wasn't the picture of a spontaneous act of violence, but something simmering much longer. In the kitchen drawer, beneath a stack of unopened bills, was a small, leather-bound notebook. Inside were dozens of handwritten notes in a mix of erratic cursive and block letters. Repeated phrases read, "She's not who I thought she was, and I see it in her eyes now." Neighbors were stunned. The Kellers had lived on Brookhaven Lane for 7 years. To outsiders, they were the typical suburban couple, quiet, polite, often seen walking their dog, Sadie. No history of police calls, no previous domestic reports. But something in that house had been unraveling in silence. Investigators soon recovered the wife's phone and accessed the Facetime history. The last call, time-stamped just 15 minutes before her death, was with a man listed only as Daniel. A search of her contact list showed no further details. The Facetime app had been open when the police arrived. Laura had been speaking to someone moments before the fatal shot. The question now facing the police wasn't only whether this was a crime of passion, it was how far the cracks in this marriage had run, and whether this was a single moment of madness or the tragic endpoint of a long, hidden descent. Detective Amanda Reyes was assigned to lead the investigation. A seasoned officer with over a decade of experience in domestic homicide cases, she began with the most immediate source of potential insight, Matthew Keller himself. The initial interrogation was recorded in full at the Cedar Glen Police Department. Matthew appeared composed at first, exhausted but alert. When asked why he called 911, his voice cracked, "Because I didn't want to run. I wasn't going to be that guy." According to his statement, he had returned home early from his night shift as a warehouse supervisor. He entered the living room quietly and saw Laura on the couch, facing the TV, laughing. "I thought she was watching something," he said. "Then I heard a man's voice. I stepped closer and I saw his face on the phone." Matthew claimed that what pushed him over the edge wasn't just the call, but Laura's reaction when she saw him. "She looked up at me like I didn't matter, like I was just some background noise in her life." He said the gun, a 9mm Glock he kept in a locked drawer, was retrieved in a fog. "It just happened," he repeated, like a switch flipped. But the physical evidence began to contradict the idea of a heat-of-the-moment act. The drawer containing the weapon showed no signs of forced opening. The gun was clean and loaded, as if it had been prepared earlier. Ballistics placed the shot at a close range, but with a direct trajectory suggesting a moment of stillness. This wasn't a gun raised in panic. It was aimed. Precise. Detective Reyes then turned to the digital forensics team. Within hours, they had accessed Laura's phone backup. The man listed as Daniel had a different last name on the contact profile, Daniel Evers. He was not from Cedar Glen. His phone number had an area code linked to Indianapolis. The Facetime history showed frequent late-night calls over the past 2 months, sometimes lasting more than an hour. The last call, the one just before her death, lasted 12 minutes and 46 seconds. Laura and Daniel had exchanged several saved messages. Some were flirtatious, some explicitly romantic. One text, dated 10 days before the murder, read, "I wish I could tell him, but he wouldn't understand, not like you do." Detective Reyes knew this wasn't just a case of betrayal, it was a slow-burn collapse, one that had been unfolding long before the shot was fired. The next morning, Detective Reyes and Officer Trent Mills flew to Indianapolis to locate and question Daniel Evers. A search warrant issued by the Cedar Glen District Court gave them temporary access to Evers' residence, a one-bedroom apartment in a mixed-use building downtown. Daniel, a 36-year-old freelance graphic designer, was cooperative, though visibly shaken when informed that Laura had been killed. He admitted to having a romantic relationship with her, but claimed it was entirely virtual. "We met on a photography forum back in February," he said. "At first it was about sharing ideas and critiquing each other's work. Then it just turned into talking about life." According to Daniel, Laura never explicitly told him she was married, though he had his suspicions. She said things like, "I'm not ready to leave yet, and things are complicated at home." I didn't push. Detective Reyes pressed for clarification. Had he and Laura ever met in person? Had they planned to? Daniel insisted they hadn't. He showed the detectives his phone, which revealed a string of video calls, messages, and exchanged photos. But no travel plans, no hotel bookings, nothing physical. Still, one message stood out. Dated 2 weeks before Laura's death, it read, "Maybe after October, he has no idea. I'm careful." Back in Cedar Glen, the forensic team completed their initial analysis of Matthew's notebook. The entries had no clear structure, but began escalating in tone about a month before the shooting. One page, dated August 20th, read, "She disappears into that phone every night. I'm not stupid." Another, more troubling, had a sketch of a smartphone with a bullet piercing the screen. Next to it, he had written, "If she can't stop, I will." Laura's best friend, Claire Jensen, was also interviewed. She told detectives that Laura had recently confided in her about feeling trapped. "She didn't hate Matt," Claire said, "but she was exhausted. He wasn't violent, but he was absent. She said she didn't feel seen anymore." Claire hadn't known about Daniel, but admitted she wasn't surprised. Laura was searching for something, maybe just a reason to feel wanted. Detective Reyes began to piece together the framework: a wife emotionally disengaged, a husband spiraling in silence, and a digital relationship that became the match to years of hidden resentment. Detective Reyes returned to Cedar Glen to continue piecing together the household dynamics. She requested the help of digital analyst Mark Cho to extract a deeper layer of data from both Laura and Matthew's phones. What Mark uncovered next shifted the investigation further from a spontaneous act and closer to a chilling pattern of surveillance. Matthew had installed a third-party app on his own phone 3 weeks before the murder. It was a remote monitoring tool, marketed as parental control software but capable of mirroring incoming texts, call logs, and even camera activity from another device. The app was discreetly paired to Laura's phone via a shared Wi-Fi network. He had been watching her FaceTime activity for at least 2 weeks before the shooting. The logs showed that Matthew had opened the mirroring app at least 7 times in the days leading up to the murder. The final entry occurred the night before Laura was killed. Reyes then turned her attention to the couple's internet router history and confirmed that Matthew had downloaded multiple articles on tracking infidelity without being caught. Several of the articles were focused on catching FaceTime cheaters and how to confront a cheating spouse without evidence. Forensic software also recovered deleted search history, indicating Matthew had watched online videos related to domestic violence cases and emotional betrayal. Meanwhile, a preliminary psychological screening ordered by the court was underway. The evaluating psychiatrist, Dr. Leonard Hayes, noted signs of dissociation and possible obsessive jealousy. During their first session, Matthew described his mental state in the days leading up to the shooting as like watching my life from outside my body. When asked about Laura's affair, he replied, "It wasn't just the cheating, it was the erasure. She replaced me with a voice on a screen." At the same time, a neighbor came forward with a statement that they had heard the couple arguing more frequently in recent weeks, including one incident in which Matthew was heard shouting, "I know what you're hiding," through an open window. The police had never been called, but the neighbor recalled that Laura appeared nervous the following day when walking her dog. Detective Reyes also spoke to Matthew's co-worker, Darren West, who described a significant change in his demeanor recently. Matt started showing up late, always tired, snapping at people. Then he just stopped talking at all, like something was building under the surface. Detective Reyes turned her attention to Laura's digital footprint, more specifically, whether she suspected she was being watched. Mark Cho, the forensic analyst, had begun combing through Laura's cloud backups and noticed several deleted voice memos dated within a week of her death. One stood out. In it, Laura spoke softly, almost whispering. "I don't know if I'm imagining it, but I feel like he knows. Sometimes I leave the room, and when I come back, my phone is moved. I can't prove anything, but I can feel it. It's like he's inside the walls." The memo was dated 4 days before she died. More fragments emerged. Laura had drafted, but never sent, an email addressed to Legal Aid Services of Northridge County. In the message, she requested a consultation regarding spousal privacy, emotional distress, and separation advice. The email was saved in her drafts folder but was never transmitted. Investigators believed she may have been hesitant to send it from a shared device. Meanwhile, Detective Reyes requested access to the firing range records near Cedar Glen. She discovered Matthew had signed in 3 times over the previous month. He practiced with the same make and model of the firearm used in the murder, his Glock 19. It wasn't unusual on its own. Matthew had a registered permit. But one session took place just 48 hours before Laura's death. He had brought 50 rounds and stayed for less than 30 minutes. The next interview led Reyes to April, Laura's younger sister. April had a strained relationship with Matthew and hadn't been to their house in over a year. "I never liked how quiet he was around people," April said. "He was polite, but there was something cold about him, like he was wearing a mask." She also revealed something investigators hadn't heard before. "Last Thanksgiving, Laura came to my apartment for the weekend. She said she just needed space. She cried for 2 straight hours, not because he hit her or anything, but because she felt invisible, like she could die in that house and no one would notice." Those were her words. As Reyes compiled her notes, a pattern became clearer. Laura wasn't just unhappy, she was afraid. Not of physical violence, necessarily, but of disappearing slowly into a marriage where her presence no longer felt real. The murder may not have been just about betrayal. It may have been about ownership, erasure, and control. Detective Reyes contacted Northridge Legal Aid Services. A caseworker named Melissa Donahue reviewed intake records and confirmed Laura Keller had called the office anonymously 5 days before her death, inquiring about the process of emotional coercion and removal from shared property. The call lasted 12 minutes. Laura had asked about confidentiality and whether her husband would be notified if she consulted a lawyer. She never followed up with an appointment. Melissa described her tone as hesitant but clear-headed. Laura hadn't disclosed her name, but from the phone number and voice memo comparison, Reyes confirmed it had been her. She wasn't ready to act, Melissa said, but she was looking for a way out. Meanwhile, the ballistics team provided further findings. The trajectory of the bullet confirmed the shot had been fired from a standing position while Laura was seated. No signs of a physical struggle were present, no bruises, defensive wounds, or forced contact. Reyes noted the chilling implication. Laura likely didn't see it coming, or if she did, she froze. Detectives also dug into Matthew's credit card records. Over the past month, he had made 2 unusual purchases: a hardback copy of The Betrayal Bond, a book on trauma and abusive dynamics, and a small lockbox ordered online, which arrived 3 days before the shooting. It was found hidden behind cleaning supplies in the garage. Inside were printed screenshots of Laura's texts with Daniel, including photos and timestamps, along with a USB drive containing screen recordings of her Facetime calls. This wasn't impulsive rage. This was documentation, evidence he had gathered and stored. One of the most revealing discoveries came from a digital diary entry saved to Matthew's Google Drive, dated the night before the murder. "If she's going to leave me, she has to do it with shame. I won't be the villain. I've been patient, loyal, quiet. She thinks she can lie in my house and laugh in my face. Tomorrow, it ends." This entry was nearly deleted, recovered by forensic software as a temporary autosave. That detail alone raised more questions about intent and mental state. Reyes brought the findings to the district attorney's office. The working theory of the case began to shift definitively. This wasn't just a crime of passion. It was a calculated execution, masked by the illusion of emotional collapse. Detective Reyes reached out to Daniel Evers for a second interview, this time with more pointed questions. He was visibly shaken when told about the lockbox filled with saved texts and video footage. "I had no idea he was watching us," Daniel said. "That's terrifying." He confirmed he had never been contacted by Matthew, No calls, no threats, no social media attempts. "I would have remembered," he said. "Honestly, I thought she was just scared to tell him. I didn't think he even suspected." Daniel's testimony helped clarify that Matthew's actions were not a sudden reaction to a discovery, but the slow boiling of internalized rage. And that rage had been building in silence, not confrontation. Meanwhile, the DA's office reviewed the evidence, particularly the digital diary entry, lockbox contents, and timeline of Matthew's gun range visits. Prosecutor Lynn Calder told Reyes, "This was not a man who snapped. This was a man who stewed in silence and plotted. That changes everything about how we charge." Back in Cedar Glen, Reyes sat down with a neighbor from 2 doors down, Jeremy Hall, who shared something unexpected. He recalled seeing Matthew alone on the porch late at night several times during the month before the murder, sometimes for hours. He wasn't smoking, just sitting, staring at nothing. Once I asked if he was all right, and he just said, "It's all noise." Gave me chills. Matthew's psychological profile was further expanded through additional psychiatric assessments. Dr. Leonard Hayes noted signs of what he termed paranoid rumination, an obsessive mental loop in which the subject returns to the same grievance repeatedly, escalating in intensity. "He created a narrative," Hayes explained. "In that story, he was the neglected husband, the victim of emotional theft, and the more he repeated it to himself, the more he became convinced that action, violent action, was not only justified but inevitable." Reyes also obtained a calendar Laura had kept in a drawer by the kitchen. Scrawled in pencil across several days were vague but revealing entries. "Talk to someone. Library at 11. Keep it quiet." And finally, on the day she was killed, Daniel 9 p.m. She had circled the evening. She had planned to speak to him in peace. She didn't know it would be her last call. The puzzle was falling into place, not as a chaotic crime, but a controlled collapse, set in motion by a man who couldn't accept loss, not of love, but of dominance. Detective Reyes returned to the Keller residence with a warrant to conduct a secondary search, this time with a forensic document specialist and tech team in tow. The goal was to look for any last remnants of Matthew's state of mind, items that might not have seemed relevant during the first sweep. In the drawer beneath the hallway filing cabinet, they found what appeared to be a discarded manila envelope. It had no address or postage, but the name, "To Whom It May Concern," was written in bold capital letters. Inside were 4 typed pages, unsigned, undated. The first line read, "This is not an apology. This is an explanation." The document read like a mix between a diary and a personal manifesto. It laid out Matthew's interpretation of events, how he believed Laura had chosen deceit, how he had given her everything and received silence in return, and how, the moment I saw her laugh with him on the screen, I realized I had already been erased. One paragraph was particularly chilling. "People say murder is an act of rage. I disagree. Rage is loud. This was quiet. It was clarity, a final boundary against humiliation." Detectives would later determine the document had been printed on the same day as the murder. The file itself had been deleted from Matthew's home computer, but a cached version remained in the printer history log. It was never shared or mailed. It was never meant to be found, yet it said everything. In parallel, Dr. Hayes finalized his second psychological report. While he acknowledged Matthew's deteriorating mental state, he did not diagnose psychosis or a break from reality. He knew what he was doing. He understood the consequences. The narrative he built wasn't delusional. It was deliberate. He felt justified, not confused. With this foundation, Reyes met again with ADA Lynn Calder to confirm the prosecutorial direction. Calder reviewed the manifesto, the surveillance timeline, and Laura's legal inquiries. "We're going for premeditated murder," she said, "and we're including evidence of coercive control as part of the motive." Back at the precinct, Reyes also received confirmation that Matthew had made no outward disclosures to friends or family in the weeks prior. He had confided in no one. No phone calls, no written messages, no signs of hesitation. His emotional unraveling had occurred entirely in silence. The case, once perceived as a tragic domestic breakdown, now presented as something more methodical and more terrifying. A man who spoke little, acted slowly, and in the end executed a plan designed not for escape, but for finality. Detective Reyes and ADA Calder turned their attention to financial records, one last angle to ensure there were no overlooked motives. A request to the family's banking institutions showed that 6 months before the murder, Matthew and Laura had added a life insurance policy through a workplace benefits program. The policy wasn't extravagant, $100,000 with Laura listed as the insured and Matthew as the sole beneficiary, but it was still significant enough to raise a procedural question. The policy had been part of a broader renewal of employee benefits at Matthew's job. Co-workers confirmed it had been a routine HR update, and there was no evidence he had increased the coverage amount or pushed to accelerate the policy. However, Reyes noted that Matthew had withdrawn $2,000 in cash just 1 day before the murder. The reason for the withdrawal was not immediately clear. Surveillance footage from a local ATM verified the withdrawal, and bank logs showed no large purchases afterward. Reyes considered the possibility that Matthew had planned to flee, or perhaps to bribe or silence someone, but there was no follow-through. It seemed to be another aborted action, part of a fragmented and chaotic last 48 hours. Meanwhile, prosecutors met with a family law consultant to assess how Laura's digital messages and her unsent email to legal aid could be introduced in court. The consultant confirmed that although the email was never sent, the draft, paired with the recorded phone call to legal aid, would be admissible to demonstrate her intent to leave and her fear of confrontation. Detective Reyes also obtained a report from the tech team regarding the USB drive recovered in the lockbox. While most files were screenshots and recordings of Laura's Facetime calls, one folder had been password protected. After forensic decryption, it revealed personal photos from earlier in their relationship. Vacations, holidays, intimate moments. These weren't evidence of rage. They were tokens of memory, perhaps obsession. They painted a psychological portrait of a man unable to reconcile the past with the present. He didn't just kill Laura because she cheated. He killed her because she stopped being the version of her that lived in his mind. Laura's best friend, Claire, agreed to testify and shared one final voicemail Laura had left days before her death. "I'm trying to stay calm, but I don't know who I'm living with anymore. It's like he's waiting for something, watching me like I'm not even me." That message, combined with the manifesto and surveillance timeline, would anchor the prosecution's emotional case. That Laura wasn't just murdered, she was methodically erased. The focus turned briefly to the money. Detectives pulled footage from a gas station convenience store where Matthew had stopped shortly after withdrawing the $2,000. He made a small purchase, just a bottle of water, and tucked something into his jacket pocket. It wasn't conclusive. The remaining cash hadn't been recovered during the initial home search, which prompted Reyes to order a new sweep of the property, especially the attic and crawl space. On the second pass, forensic officers uncovered a plastic folder taped beneath a loose floorboard in the basement. Inside, $1,740 in cash, a second USB drive, and a printed photograph of Laura asleep on the couch, time-stamped 2 weeks before her murder. She was unaware. The photo had been taken from a distance through a hallway mirror. The image disturbed everyone who saw it. Laura looked peaceful, even vulnerable, and Matthew had chosen to preserve it, print it, and store it with the money. The second USB drive revealed more of the same. Personal images, recordings of Laura alone at home, even mundane activities like folding laundry, walking Sadie, or talking to herself while cooking, none were confrontational. They were moments captured not out of anger, but of fixation. It was surveillance dressed as intimacy. Back at the DA's office, Calder consulted with trial strategy expert Marlene Archer emphasized how critical it would be to establish a timeline that showed Laura attempting to regain control over her life while Matthew tightened his grip. "Jurors need to understand this wasn't about cheating," she said. "This was about possession. He felt entitled to her loyalty, her privacy, even her thoughts." With Archer's help, Reyes finalized the sequencing of the trial's emotional arc first. Laura's voicemail, then her calendar entries, then the call to legal aid, then the manifesto. Layer by layer, they would reconstruct the story Laura never got to tell. Meanwhile, the forensic psychologist added a final note. Matthew's fixation on Laura's image suggested he wasn't merely jealous of Daniel, he was enraged by her autonomy. When she became someone he couldn't fully predict or control, she ceased to be who he believed she was, and he couldn't tolerate that. By this point, nearly every piece of the puzzle had been locked into place. The prosecution would argue that Matthew didn't kill Laura because she betrayed him, but because she tried to exist without his permission. In the days leading up to the pretrial hearing, the defense filed a motion to suppress the manifesto and second USB drive, arguing that the search exceeded the original scope of the warrant. However, the judge reviewed the updated warrant affidavit and ruled that the second sweep had been legally justified based on newly discovered evidence. The items would remain admissible. The defense also hinted at a shift in strategy, one that would attempt to humanize Matthew as a man pushed past his breaking point. Attorney David Winslow argued that while his client's behavior may have appeared calculated, it stemmed from a prolonged psychological breakdown triggered by emotional betrayal. He was a man unraveling, Winslow said in a pretrial motion, not a man plotting. This new angle prompted the prosecution to strengthen its narrative, not only with digital and forensic evidence, but with personal accounts that captured Laura's mental state and growing isolation. Laura's co-worker, Jamie Tran, came forward with a journal Laura had left in her desk drawer at work. She had been writing in it sporadically for months. Though it didn't contain dramatic revelations, the entries offered raw, emotional glimpses. One read, "I want to feel seen again. I speak and it's like my words vanish in the air. I could scream and he wouldn't flinch." Another, dated 3 weeks before her death, read, "I keep dreaming I'm packing a suitcase and walking away. But in the dream, he's always behind me, just watching, never saying a word." Jamie also recalled Laura staying late at work, not out of necessity, but avoidance. "She used to love going home," Jamie said, "but near the end she lingered. She was scared, though she never said it outright, you could just tell." The emotional weight of these testimonies was crucial. They were designed not only to inform the jury, but to protect Laura's memory from being reduced to an affair or a mistake. Reyes, Calder, and their team worked with a victim advocacy coordinator to ensure Laura's voice remained central in the courtroom, even in her absence. Meanwhile, forensic accountants concluded that the remaining $260 from Matthew's withdrawal had not been used electronically. It was either spent in cash or still hidden. Reyes suspected it was intended for after the act, for gas, food, or escape, but that Matthew had ultimately chosen not to run. That choice alone puzzled the team. Why prepare so carefully, then stay? The final theory was chilling in its simplicity. Matthew didn't run because he didn't believe he was wrong. In his mind, the murder wasn't a crime, it was closure. The pretrial hearing brought the opposing strategies into sharp relief. Defense attorney David Winslow leaned heavily on language designed to elicit sympathy. Words like emotional collapse, betrayal trauma, and domestic desperation. He painted a picture of Matthew as a man abandoned in his own home and sought to limit the prosecution's use of terms like obsession and control. But the prosecution was prepared. ADA Lynn Calder submitted the emotional timeline presentation, over 100 carefully arranged data points chronicling Laura's gradual separation from her marriage, paralleled by Matthew's increasing surveillance and isolation. The judge approved its use during trial as long as it adhered strictly to factual entries and verified timestamps. On the same day, Reyes and her team held a final witness preparation session with April, Laura's sister. It had been difficult for her to speak publicly about her siblings' fear, but she agreed to testify after seeing the second USB's contents. "That wasn't love," she told them. "That was watching someone like they were an object." April would describe the Thanksgiving visit when Laura had broken down in her apartment. She would repeat Laura's exact words, "I don't feel real anymore." Meanwhile, the victim advocacy coordinator introduced another powerful piece of evidence, a draft letter Laura had started in the Notes app on her tablet titled simply, "If I Leave." It was never sent, but the intention was clear. In it, Laura listed the belongings she would take, the friends she could stay with, and the names of 2 legal aid attorneys she had researched. The letter ended with, "I'm not doing this to hurt him. I'm doing this to find myself again. I need to breathe." Though unsigned and undated, metadata showed the file had last been edited just 2 days before the murder. Prosecutors now had another emotional artifact to illustrate Laura's mindset. Not fearful and reckless, but cautious, deliberate, and desperate for freedom. Back in court, Dr. Hayes submitted his final expert summary. His report argued that Matthew did not display signs of clinical psychosis or temporary insanity. Rather, he exhibited a rigid entitlement to emotional ownership over his spouse. The murder, he concluded, was not the end of a breakdown. It was the fulfillment of a belief. If I can't have her as I remember her, no one will. All that remained was for the jury to see the full picture, and for Laura's voice, through her notes, her friends, and her digital footprint, to finally be heard. Jury selection began under tight scrutiny. Given the emotionally charged nature of the case, both sides pushed for careful vetting. The defense focused on identifying jurors who might be sympathetic to marital stress and betrayal, while the prosecution prioritized those with a deeper understanding of psychological abuse and patterns of coercive control. After a full day of voir dire, a jury was seated. 7 women, 5 men. Their backgrounds varied. 2 teachers, a retired paramedic, a tech analyst, a single mother, a pastor's wife. Some were divorced. Some had served on juries before. Each came into the courtroom with limited knowledge of the case, but it would not remain that way for long. Opening arguments began on a cold Monday morning. ADA Lynn Calder stepped forward first. Her voice was measured, her expression calm, but her words cut deep. This is not a story about a man who lost control. It's a story about a man who wanted control so badly, so completely, that he believed his wife had no right to a life beyond him. She walked the jury through the emotional timeline, emphasizing Laura's recorded fears, unsent letters, and calendar notes. She paused on the phrase, "I don't feel real anymore," and asked the jurors to hold on to those words as they listened. Then she projected an image of Laura, one taken weeks before her death. Smiling in her backyard, unaware of what was building around her. Calder turned to the jury. She didn't know that the man behind the camera wasn't documenting their life. He was preparing for its end. The defense, led by David Winslow, countered with emotion. He described Matthew as a broken man, not a monster, who had watched his marriage dissolve in front of him. He acknowledged the surveillance, the manifesto, the journals, but claimed they were signs of emotional deterioration, not calculation. This was a man unraveling in silence, overwhelmed, ashamed, and ultimately lost. Still, Winslow carefully avoided denying that Matthew pulled the trigger. Instead, he focused on reframing the motive, trying to downgrade the killing to a crime born of emotional distress. The first witness called was Jamie Tran. She described Laura as bright, private, and recently, distant. She shared the entries from the work journal and recounted nights when Laura stayed late for no reason. She didn't say it, but we all knew. Something wasn't right at home. Then came the voicemail. The courtroom grew quiet as Laura's voice played. "I don't know who I'm living with anymore. It's like he's waiting for something." The jurors didn't look away. Some leaned forward. Others glanced at Matthew, who sat still, face unreadable. By day's end, the prosecution had introduced a compelling foundation of fear, pattern, and planning. The emotional scaffolding was in place. Now they would begin threading in the evidence, bit by bit, to show that the murder wasn't sudden. It was structured. The next morning, Laura's sister April took the stand. She was calm, but visibly tense. As Ada Calder guided her through the testimony, April spoke in detail about their close childhood bond, Laura's early optimism in the marriage, and how that slowly changed. She stopped talking about Matthew, April said. She used to call him sweet, gentle, then she stopped using any words at all. I had to ask if everything was okay, and even then she'd just say, "It's fine, it's just quiet now." But I could tell something was wrong. Calder brought April to the Thanksgiving visit, the emotional breakdown. She cried in the kitchen for 2 hours, told me she felt like a ghost in her own life, that she thought maybe he didn't even see her anymore, just what he wanted her to be. April paused, fighting back tears as she recounted Laura's final text message to her. "Wish me luck. I think tonight's the night I tell him. I can't live like this anymore." The time stamp. 90 minutes before she was killed. Cross-examination from the defense was minimal. Winslow avoided discrediting April directly, instead suggesting that her views were interpretive and emotionally biased. But the damage was done. The jury had seen Laura not as a cheating wife, but a trapped woman trying to break free. Following April, Dr. Hayes was brought to the stand. He summarized his clinical findings from weeks of evaluating Matthew. Under Calder's direction, he outlined Matthew's profile: emotionally avoidant, obsessive, prone to rumination, and deeply fixated on preserving control over his perception of reality. He didn't react to infidelity, he reacted to a shift in identity, Hayes explained. His wife became someone autonomous, unknowable, and in that shift, he lost control and sought to reclaim it violently. The jury listened closely as Dr. Hayes described the difference between emotional breakdown and premeditated fixation. A breakdown is chaotic, but this case reflects structure, surveillance, planning, symbolic documentation of betrayal. That isn't collapse, that's intent. Later that day, the prosecution introduced one of the more haunting visual exhibits: the printed photo of Laura, asleep on the couch, taken without her knowledge. It was displayed on the courtroom screen alongside the timestamp and metadata. He kept this hidden, Calder told the jury, because it wasn't a memory, it was a moment of possession, one final snapshot before he decided she belonged to no one else. Several jurors looked away from the image. One quietly wiped a tear. The prosecution had one more move before the week's close: Daniel Evers. His testimony was scheduled next, and with it would come not just clarity, but the final emotional spark of the trial. Daniel Evers took the stand the following morning. He looked exhausted, his eyes lined with shadows, his voice low but steady. A man who had never met Laura in person, now seated in the courtroom where her life, and the man who ended it, were being judged. ADA Calder began gently, asking Daniel how he met Laura. He explained they'd met in a photography forum 9 months prior. It started with shared critiques, then conversations about life, marriage, loneliness. Over time, a bond grew, not physical, but emotional. "We talked almost every night," he said. "I knew she was married, but she never bad-mouthed him. She just said she felt forgotten, like she didn't exist in her own home." The courtroom was silent. Even Matthew, for once, seemed to shift uncomfortably in his chair. Calder asked about the night Laura was killed. Daniel's voice wavered. "She called just after 9 p.m. We were talking about a book we were both reading. She was laughing, and then she just looked up. Her expression changed, like she'd seen something, or someone." He paused, and then the screen went black. Calder asked what Daniel did next. "I tried calling back, texted, nothing. At first I thought the call dropped, but then I saw the news the next morning. I didn't know her last name until I saw her photo on the article." Calder introduced digital records that confirmed Daniel had tried calling Laura twice after the FaceTime ended. His call logs matched the timeline of the shooting almost to the minute. On cross-examination, the defense tried to frame Daniel's role as intrusive, even provocative. They questioned his judgment in engaging emotionally with a married woman. Daniel didn't react defensively. "I didn't go looking to ruin anything," he replied. "I just listened. That's what she needed, someone who saw her." The response landed heavily. A juror blinked rapidly. Another looked down at their notepad. With Daniel's testimony, the emotional arc of the trial neared its peak. The jury had now heard from Laura's sister, best friend, co-worker, her own digital voice, and finally the one person she'd confided in most near the end. As court adjourned for the day, Calder returned to her office with a sense of resolve. The narrative was clear. Laura wasn't unfaithful. She was unseen. She wasn't manipulative. She was quietly suffocating. And Matthew hadn't broken down. He had calculated the moment to make her silence permanent. In the days to come, all that would remain was to connect the emotional testimony to the hard evidence, the surveillance, the planning, the manifesto, and the final act of control. With testimony complete, both sides now shifted focus to closing strategies. ADA Calder and Detective Reyes spent the evening before closing arguments reviewing the digital timeline exhibit one final time. They arranged it not only by date, but by emotional evolution. Beginning with Laura's journal entries from her workplace, the timeline showed her initial attempts to rationalize Matthew's withdrawal. Maybe it's just work stress. Maybe he's tired. Then the voice memos where confusion gave way to unease. "I don't know who I'm living with anymore." Followed by her unsent legal aid email, her message to her sister April. "Wish me luck. I think tonight's the night I tell him." And ending with the moment the FaceTime call dropped, and Laura was gone. Calder knew the jury had seen the forensic evidence, the weapon, the tracking software, the printed surveillance photos, but now she needed them to feel the motive, not as a sharp emotional outburst, but as a slow, suffocating grip, tightening with purpose. She opened closing arguments with the theme that had carried through from the beginning. This was not a man who lost control. This was a man who demanded control and eliminated what he could no longer possess. She guided the jury through each decision Matthew made, downloading spyware, recording calls, printing messages, going to the shooting range, hiding money, preparing the gun. "These are not the actions of a man consumed by sudden emotion," she said. "These are the actions of a man building a cage, and when the woman inside that cage rattled the door, he decided to close it permanently." She reminded them of Dr. Hayes's words. Matthew didn't break from reality. He could no longer tolerate it. Then came the visual exhibits. The jury saw Laura's words, typed, recorded, scrawled in the margins of her notebook. They saw her smile in candid photographs, slowly replaced by silence in surveillance videos. They heard the voicemail that ended with, "I'm trying to stay calm." And then the screen faded to the final image, Laura asleep on the couch, taken without her knowledge. Still, peaceful, unknowing. The room sat in silence. When the defense took the floor, Winslow maintained a narrow focus. He did not deny the facts, but urged the jury to consider emotional complexity. Yes, he monitored her. Yes, he felt betrayed. Yes, he acted terribly. But that does not mean he plotted murder. People do irrational things when their world collapses. He described Matthew as isolated, emotionally overwhelmed, pushed beyond reason. He didn't pack a bag. He didn't run. He called 911 himself. That's not a criminal mastermind. That's a broken man. But his argument lacked momentum. The prosecution had left little space for ambiguity. The courtroom recessed for jury deliberation, and while the legal machinery slowed, the emotional weight lingered. Reyes walked out into the courthouse hallway, exhausted but composed. She had seen many cases, but this one wasn't about proving what happened. It was about proving why. And she believed the jury now understood that the crime didn't start with the gun. It started with erasure. Deliberations began at 9:02 a.m. The 12 jurors were escorted into a private room with stacks of organized evidence binders, exhibit photos, and transcripts. For the prosecution, it was now a waiting game. By noon, the jury submitted a request to review Laura's final text to her sister and her unsent "if I leave" note. That alone suggested they were focusing on motive, on Laura's intent to leave and Matthew's reaction to it. At 2:47 p.m., a second request. Playback of the voicemail Laura left for her friend Jamie. The courtroom was briefly reconvened for the jury to hear it again, as Laura's voice played, "I don't know who I'm living with anymore." The room was silent. Even Matthew didn't move. Detective Reyes watched from the gallery, arms folded, eyes fixed. She'd seen verdicts swing before. Even with overwhelming evidence, uncertainty could creep in. All it took was one juror clinging to the idea that this was somehow a reaction, not a plan. But just before 5 p.m., the bailiff emerged with a note. The jury has reached a verdict. Court reconvened. Laura's sister April gripped a tissue in one hand and her mother's hand in the other. Daniel Evers sat in the back row, head bowed. Matthew Keller stood as the judge asked the foreperson if the jury had reached a unanimous decision. "We have, Your Honor." The verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. A muffled sob came from behind Calder. April exhaled audibly. Matthew's face remained blank. The judge thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them with solemn words. Sentencing would follow in 1 week. Matthew was remanded to state custody immediately, with no opportunity for bail. Outside the courthouse, reporters had already begun gathering. Reyes declined to comment but nodded briefly to April as she passed, a silent acknowledgement of what had been fought for and won. In the days that followed, the team focused on impact statements. April began drafting hers with a therapist's support. She wanted to speak directly to her sister. The version of you he tried to erase but couldn't. Daniel was asked if he wanted to contribute a written statement. He agreed, though he requested anonymity outside the courtroom. His words would be read aloud by the victim's advocate. Laura's co-worker, Jamie, also agreed to submit a brief letter describing Laura's final weeks. Working late, walking slower, but still smiling when she could. The media reaction was swift. Headlines ranged from Facetime killer convicted in chilling case to obsessive control ends in murder. Analysts debated the role of digital surveillance, coercive control, and how often these patterns go unspoken until it's too late. Inside the prosecution office, ADA Calder and Detective Reyes sat together for the first time in weeks, without paperwork between them. "She never got to finish that letter," Reyes said. "No," Calder replied, "but now someone else will." 1 week after the guilty verdict, the courtroom reconvened for sentencing. It was a smaller crowd, no media frenzy, no cameras, just family, court staff, attorneys, and a handful of observers. The air was still. Laura's sister, April, was the first to speak during the victim impact statements. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied with each word. "You didn't just kill my sister. You tried to erase her," she said, looking directly at Matthew for the first time. "But she's louder now than she ever was in this courtroom, in the news, in the letters she never got to send. You didn't stop her. You made the whole world listen." Next, a victim's advocate read a written statement from Daniel Evers. "I didn't know her full story, but I knew the version of her that was still trying to hope. I wish I could have told her it was okay to leave, that she didn't need permission to feel alive." Then came Laura's coworker, Jamie, who spoke softly about Laura's quietness in the weeks before her death, and the small things, the way she smiled when she talked about books, the way she checked her reflection like she wasn't sure she was really there. Matthew Keller was given an opportunity to speak. He declined. The judge delivered the sentence swiftly: life in prison without the possibility of parole. She did not editorialize. The facts had already spoken. The absence, more than the act, had defined the case. After the hearing, ADA Calder and Detective Reyes stood with Laura's family outside the courthouse. There were no press statements, only silent embraces. In the months that followed, the case gained traction among advocacy groups focused on coercive control, digital stalking, and invisible forms of domestic abuse. Laura's story became the subject of a documentary segment. The district attorney's office launched a post-trial campaign on recognizing emotional abuse signs, featuring excerpts from Laura's journals, her calendar, and that chilling quote that anchored the entire case: "I don't feel real anymore." Daniel returned to Indianapolis and quietly resumed his freelance work. He never spoke publicly again. April became involved with a survivor support organization, using her sister's story to help other women in emotionally abusive relationships recognize the signs earlier. And Reyes, she added Laura's case to her training lectures for new detectives. Not as an example of a brutal crime, but as a reminder. Not all abuse leaves bruises. Some of it hides in silence, in calendars, in voice memos never sent. Some of it is only seen in hindsight. Laura never got to finish her letter, but others would. And in those letters, her voice would live on, not erased, not silenced, heard.